There is a river, older than the oldest story you have ever been told. It runs south of Egypt, further south than most maps cared to draw. The world learned that civilization began in the north, along a delta, beneath a sky full of gods, with animal heads and golden skin. But the ground has been telling a different story for decades now. A civilization was already here, with kings and ceremony and its own understanding of how the cosmos was organized, while Egypt itself was still taking shape. We were never taught this. And the question worth carrying with you into sleep tonight is not complicated. Why not? Let the room go dark. Let the river carry you south. The oldest story does not begin where you were told it begins. Chapter 1. The River. Before the Kingdom. A sandstone cliff rises from the east bank of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan. It is not a famous cliff. No tourist buses stop here. No guidebook describes the light at this particular hour. The way the late afternoon sun catches the pale stone and turns it briefly, the color of something molten, before the desert cools and the color fades and the cliff becomes simply itself again. Patient and indifferent and very old. If you stand at the base of that cliff and look at the river moving past you, you are standing in one of the oldest continuously inhabited landscapes on Earth. The water has been moving past this point for longer than any human story. The people who first settled these banks did not know they were at the beginning of something. They were simply at the river, which was where the water was. And where the water was, there was life. The Nile is more than 4,000 miles long. Almost everything most people know about it stops at Egypt. The delta, the pyramids, the green ribbon running through desert on both sides, the gift of the river that made one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations possible. That story is true, and it is incomplete in a way that this journey is going to spend the night correcting. The river begins far to the south. Two great tributaries feed it. The Blue Nile carries the floods that made Egyptian agriculture possible, rising from the Ethiopian highlands and arriving each year with the silt that rebuilt the farmland of the delta. The White Nile carries the volume that keeps the whole system running. Its sources distributed across the Great Lakes of equatorial Africa. Both tributaries join near what is now Khartoum in central Sudan. And from that confluence, the river runs north for more than 2,000 miles before it reaches the Mediterranean. The stretch between what is now southern Egypt and central Sudan is the stretch this story is about. The ancient Egyptians called it Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, a name that told you everything about how Egypt perceived the people who lived there. Skilled archers, formidable fighters, people you did not cross lightly. What the name did not tell you, and what Egypt perhaps preferred not to acknowledge, was that the land south of its borders had been producing something that looked remarkably like organized political power for a very long time. To understand any of that properly, you need to understand the geography, because in this part of the world, geography is destiny. Between the first cataract of the Nile at what is now Aswan in southern Egypt and the sixth cataract far to the south in Sudan, the river drops through a series of natural barriers that defined the political world of the ancient northeast African interior for thousands of years. A cataract is a stretch of shallow rapids and boulders and swirling water that makes navigation extremely difficult or impossible for large boats. 6 of them. Natural walls. Checkpoints that determined who could move goods and armies and ideas from one part of the valley to the next. The first cataract at Aswan was the traditional southern border of ancient Egypt for most of its history. Everything south of that point was Nubia, and Nubia, shaped by those rocky barriers in the river, developed its own rhythms, its own trade networks, its own political structures, largely on its own terms. This matters enormously for how you interpret everything that follows. A great deal of what people assume about ancient Nubia comes filtered through Egyptian sources, Egyptian texts and carvings and diplomatic records, all produced by a civilization with a very specific interest in presenting itself as the dominant power in the region. When you read Egyptian sources about Nubia, you are reading a story told by a neighbor who sometimes wanted to trade with Nubia, sometimes wanted to conquer it, sometimes feared it, and occasionally was ruled by it. None of those positions produce neutral testimony. The Nile south of Aswan moves through landscapes that are different from the fertile delta of Lower Egypt. The flood plain narrows. The desert presses closer. The cataracts break the river into distinct sections, each with its own ecology and its own agricultural possibilities. In the region, scholars call the Dongola Reach, in what is now central Sudan. The valley opens into broad, fertile plains where agriculture was not only possible, but genuinely productive. Those fertile zones were where the population concentrated, where grain was grown and cattle were raised and trade goods accumulated, and where people, in the way that people always do when resources allow it, began to organize themselves into something more complex than a village. The trade goods that Nubia produced were among the most valuable in the ancient world. Gold above everything else. The desert to the east of the Nile Valley contained some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world, and Nubian gold was flowing north into Egypt for thousands of years. Ivory from elephant herds, living further south. Ebony wood from tropical forests. Ostrich feathers and eggs, which had ceremonial value across the ancient world. Encens, raisin. Exotic animals, particularly the large cats that Egyptian pharaohs kept as symbols of royal power. These goods did not just pass through Nubia as a corridor. Nubian communities controlled the trade. They built the networks. They understood what the markets to the north wanted and organized their societies around producing and moving those goods efficiently. That kind of economic organization does not happen without political organization. You cannot build long-distance trade networks without people who can make agreements, enforce them, coordinate labor, and accumulate enough authority to keep the whole system running. The traditional telling of African history placed Egypt first. Egypt as the origin point, Egypt as the teacher, and Nubia as the student, borrowing culture and religion and political organization from the more advanced civilization to the north. This telling was not simply a product of ancient Egyptian self-promotion. It was reinforced by the way modern scholarship developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Egyptology became a mature academic field and Nubian studies remained far behind. When European scholars who dominated the field often carried assumptions about African history that we now recognize as deeply wrong, the result was a picture of Nubia filtered almost entirely through the Egyptian perspective. Nubia as a tributary, Nubia as a resource zone, Nubia as, in one phrase that appeared in serious academic writing, Amere Corridor. That picture is not accurate, and the evidence that makes it inaccurate has been accumulating for decades. In the ground, waiting to be understood. In the soil of what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan, archaeologists have found things that forced a genuine rethinking of who was first and what that question even means. That rethinking begins in a place called Qustul. Qustul is a site in the far south of what is now Egypt, just north of the Sudanese border. In the 1960s and early 1970s, a team from the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago conducted excavations there before the area was flooded by the reservoir created by the Aswan High Dam. They were working against the clock. The water was coming. Whatever was in the ground had to be found and recorded before it was gone forever. What they found was a cemetery of rulers. Objects in those graves bore imagery that some scholars would later argue paralleled the visual language of early Egyptian kingship. A figure in a tall crown. A boat procession. Osherek. The rectangular enclosure surrounding a royal name in early Egyptian writing. The crucial question was the date. When was this cemetery in use? The answer that emerged placed it approximately 5,000 to 5,300 years ago, in the period when Egypt was just beginning to develop the visual language of pharaonic power. The scholar Bruce Williams, who analyzed the Qustul material in detail in the 1980s, argued that what the cemetery represented was evidence of a Nubian royal tradition developing simultaneously with, and possibly influencing, the early Egyptian royal tradition. That was a significant claim, and it attracted serious scrutiny. Some scholars found the evidence compelling. Others, including David O'Connor and other leading Egyptologists, raised specific objections. The dating was questioned. The iconographic parallels were challenged as not sufficiently specific to prove the direction of influence. The interpretation, critics argued, went beyond what the physical evidence could securely support. The debate continues, and honesty requires saying that clearly, without converting an ongoing academic conversation into a settled verdict. What can be said with confidence sits in a different place from the specific origin claims. The communities living along the Nile, south of the First Cataract, during this early period, were not the culturally dependent population that older scholarship implied. They had their own ceramic traditions of considerable quality. They produced objects of real sophistication, and their elite dead were buried in ways that reflect a clear sense of hierarchical social organization, with some people receiving far more elaborate burial treatment than others. The river does not care about origin stories. It simply runs north, carrying water that began its journey far to the south, in mountains and lakes that Egypt could not see and sometimes could not imagine. The civilization that grew along that southern stretch was not an echo of what happened in Egypt. It was, at minimum, a parallel development, and at maximum, something that the conventional history of the ancient world has not yet fully reckoned with. That reckoning begins now. Chapter 2. Ta-Seti, the land of the bow. Hold a specific object in your mind. A ceramic incense burner, small enough to fit in 2 hands, decorated with scenes pressed into its surface before firing. Scenes rendered in a visual shorthand that some Egyptologists recognized immediately, though others would read that recognition very differently. A ruler on a throne, a tall crown, a boat procession, a serek enclosing what appears to be a royal name. This object came from the ground at Qustul. It is roughly 5,000 years old, and it is, depending on how you read it, either a fascinating regional variation on a visual tradition developing simultaneously across the northeastern African world, or evidence that something we were told began in Egypt may have roots that reach further south. Bruce Williams chose the second reading. His analysis of the Cemetery L material, published through the Oriental Institute in the 1980s, was careful and detailed and genuinely unsettling to the conventional picture of how civilization developed in the ancient Nile Valley. He argued that the Ta-Seti kingdom represented not a provincial imitation of Egyptian royal culture, but an independent origin point for some of the iconographic traditions Egypt later used to define its own royal identity. The scholarly response was not simple rejection or simple acceptance. It was something more complicated and more interesting. David O'Connor, one of the most respected Egyptologists of his generation, argued that the iconographic parallels were not as specific as Williams suggested, that what appeared to be a white crown might be a different object entirely, and that the interpretation imposed a narrative of Nubian priority that the physical evidence could not securely support. Other scholars pointed out that the dating of the cemetery L material, while broadly accepted, carried margins of uncertainty that made precise chronological claims about priority difficult to defend. These are legitimate objections. They have not been resolved. What can be said with confidence sits in a different place. The Nubian A group people. The communities living along the Nile, south of the First Cataract, during the period roughly 5,000 to approximately 5,300 years ago, were not the culturally dependent population that older scholarship implied. They had their own ceramic traditions. They participated in long-distance trade networks. They produced objects of real sophistication. And their elite dead were buried in ways that reflect clear hierarchical social organization. With some people receiving far more elaborate burial treatment than others, that is a picture of a society that had already developed significant internal complexity. Now step back from the specific debate and think about what the name Ta-Seti tells us. The name comes from Egyptian sources. The Egyptians called this region Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, a name appearing in some of the earliest Egyptian inscriptions that survive. It tells you how Egypt perceived its southern neighbor, not as a cultural dependency, not as a passive zone of resources, as a place defined by a military identity, a place whose people were known for a specific and formidable fighting tradition. The bow was the defining weapon of Nubian warriors for thousands of years. Egyptian texts and carvings from multiple periods show Nubian archers as among the most feared soldiers in the ancient northeast African world. The Egyptians recruited Nubian bowmen into their own armies from very early in their history. Later in the Middle Kingdom period, they organized entire units of Nubian soldiers, called Meroe, who served as police and military forces throughout Egypt. That military reputation did not appear from nowhere. It reflected a warrior tradition developed over centuries in the environment of the Nile south of the First Cataract, where communities lived close to the desert, where raiding and defense were constant realities, and where the ability to project force at distance with a bow was a survival skill of the highest order. The oldest written name for this region defines the people by their capacity for resistance, not by what they traded, not by their kings or their gods or their cities, by their weapons. Egypt was saying, from the very beginning of its written history, that the people to the south were not to be taken lightly. The A-group culture that produced Cemetery L appears to have declined sharply around 5,100 years ago. The reasons are debated. Some scholars connect the decline to increasing pressure from the newly unified Egyptian state under its first pharaohs, who may have conducted military campaigns that disrupted the existing social structures. The archaeological record shows a significant reduction in the richness of burials during this period, consistent with some form of disruption. But south of this zone, further up the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, something different was happening. In the region around the Third Cataract, a new center of power was forming. It would eventually produce one of the most impressive urban cultures in ancient Africa, a civilization that most of the world has never heard of, that controlled trade routes spanning hundreds of miles, that built a monumental architecture entirely its own. The story now moves further south, even as the river itself continues north. And what grew in the south was not a copy of what was growing in the north. It was something the world has been underestimating for a very long time. Chapter 3. What archaeology can and cannot tell us. A scholar is sitting in a room in Chicago in the early 1980s. On the table in front of her is a translation she has spent months working through. She can read the Egyptian hieroglyphics with complete fluency. She has spent 20 years learning to read them. But the document she is working with is not telling the story she expected it to tell. And the question she is sitting with at this table, in this room, is the kind of question that can reorder everything you thought you knew about a subject. The question is simple. What if we have been reading the evidence in the wrong direction all along? That question, in various forms, has been the central question of Nubian studies for the last half-century. And, before this story goes any further into the history itself, this chapter needs to exist. Not because what comes next is less interesting. It is more interesting, but because how you listen to the rest of this story matters as much as what you hear. Everything we know about ancient Nubia arrives through filters. That sentence is true of all history to some degree. But ancient Nubia sits at an extreme end of that problem, for reasons that are specific and worth understanding directly. The first filter is the source problem. Ancient Egypt was a literate civilization that produced enormous quantities of written records, carved inscriptions, administrative papyri, religious texts, royal annals. Egypt wrote about itself constantly. It wrote about Nubia regularly, because Nubia was its neighbor and its trading partner, and occasionally its military adversary, and sometimes its conqueror. But Nubia, for most of its ancient history, did not produce a writing system of its own until the later Meroitic period. The earlier Nubian cultures left no texts, no royal annals describing their own kings from their own perspective, no religious literature explaining what they believed about the cosmos, no private letters between ordinary people going about ordinary lives. What they left was objects, pottery and jewelry and weapons and grave goods, and the physical remains of their buildings and the bones of their dead. These things are real evidence. Archaeology can do a great deal with them, but they cannot tell us what people thought. They cannot tell us what a king believed about his own authority, or what a community understood about where it came from. For that kind of evidence, scholars studying ancient Nubia are almost entirely dependent on Egyptian sources. And Egyptian sources about Nubia were not written to tell the Nubian story. The second filter is more recent and more troubling. The academic discipline that studies ancient Egypt and its neighbors developed primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries, in European universities and through European-led expeditions, at a time when European colonial power over Africa was near its peak. The scholars who built the field brought with them the intellectual assumptions of their era, assumptions about racial hierarchy and civilizational development that we now recognize as deeply wrong and that shaped what those scholars looked for and found significant. The specific consequences for Nubia were direct and lasting. When George Reisner, the American archaeologist, whose early 20th century excavations at Kerma produced substantial evidence of a major indigenous urban center, analyzed that evidence, he concluded that Kerma must have been an Egyptian administrative outpost managed by Egyptian officials, not a Nubian city, not evidence of indigenous African urban complexity. The evidence did not support that conclusion, but Reisner's interpretation, published in authoritative volumes by a prestigious institution, shaped how Kerma was understood in the scholarly literature for decades. It was not until Charles Bonnet's new excavation program, begun in 1977, that the indigenous character of Kerma civilization was established on sufficiently secure evidential footing that the earlier interpretation could no longer be defended. 60 years. That is how long a wrong interpretation, rooted in colonial assumptions, dominated the scholarly literature on one of the most significant urban centers in ancient Africa. Now pause on that for a moment. Somewhere in northern Sudan, the ruins of Kerma were in the ground during all of those 60 years. The Defufa was standing in the desert during all of those 60 years, patient and unchanged, containing in its mud brick walls the evidence of everything that Reisner's framework could not see. A civilization was present and invisible at the same time, not because the evidence was missing, because the framework for reading it was wrong. That image, a building standing in plain sight in the desert, while the scholarship looking at it consistently failed to see what it was, is the clearest way to understand what the second filter actually means in practice. The third filter is physical, and it is irreversible. The Aswan High Dam, constructed between 1960 and 1970, created a reservoir that submerged an enormous stretch of the Nile Valley, containing some of the most archaeologically significant land in the ancient world. The region around the first and second cataracts, the zone of most intensive Nubian-Egyptian interaction from the earliest periods of contact, is now underwater. The UNESCO Nubian campaign organized an international effort to document and salvage what could be saved before the flooding. Abu Simbel was famously cut apart and reassembled on higher ground. Other monuments were moved to museums. But the salvage was necessarily incomplete. Ordinary sites, the settlements and small cemeteries and agricultural installations that would have told the story of everyday Nubian life across thousands of years, received far less attention than the monumental ones. The knowledge that was in that ground is not waiting for future archaeologists with better technology. It is under 50 meters of water, behind a dam that will not be removed. The fourth filter involves a more recent complication. As Nubian studies began correcting the long bias of the field in the 1970s and 80s, it attracted attention from scholars and advocates, motivated by the entirely understandable desire to recover African contributions to world civilization from the dismissal those contributions had received. Some claims made in this context went beyond what the evidence supported. These overcorrections created a secondary problem, giving critics ammunition to dismiss genuine and well-supported advances along with the overclaimed ones. The result was a period of confusion in which legitimate revision of the historical record became entangled with unsupported claims, making it harder for general audiences to understand what was actually established and what was contested. Having looked at these filters honestly, it becomes possible to use the evidence responsibly, to say what the physical record shows and what it does not show, to resist the pull of a simple narrative, because the actual history is more interesting than any simple narrative would be. The scholar Timothy Kendall, who has worked extensively on the Nubian site of Jebel Barkal for several decades, has described his experience of excavating there as something like reading a book whose pages have been scrambled and many of which are missing entirely. You can make sense of the pages you have. You can sometimes figure out where missing pages belong. But you have to be honest about which pages you are reading and which pages you are guessing at. That is the right posture for this subject. The pages we have are remarkable. What they show is a civilization of genuine depth and complexity that was written out of the standard history of the ancient world for reasons that had very little to do with the importance of what happened there. Bringing those pages back into the story does not require pretending we have pages we do not have. It requires reading the ones we do have with the seriousness and the care they deserve. The river is still flowing past the place where Reisner stood with his wrong interpretation, and the Defufa stood with its patient truth. Past the place where the evidence was in the ground before the water came. Past the place where the work of recovery is still happening. Season by season. In the laboratories and the field camps and the libraries, where the story of ancient Nubia is being slowly, carefully, honestly restored. What we know is enough to change the story. What we do not know is enough to keep it open. Both of those things are true at the same time. Chapter 4. The Kerma culture, before Kush, had a name. On a flat plain near the third cataract of the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, a mud brick structure rises from the desert. It is not beautiful in the way that photographs make ancient monuments beautiful. There are no carvings on its exterior surface. No gold leaf. No painted columns. It is a massive rectangle of fired and unfired brick. Roughly 54 meters long and 27 meters wide, rising to a preserved height of around 18 meters in some sections. Its walls are thick enough that the interior temperature remains relatively stable, even when the desert outside reaches temperatures that are difficult to stand in for long. The local people call it defufa. The word means, roughly, a large mud brick building. The building has been standing in some form for approximately 4,000 years. Everything around it has changed many times over. The defufa has simply stood there, patient and massive, outlasting every political arrangement that came before and after the civilization that built it. Inside, narrow corridors connect small chambers whose original purpose we cannot state with certainty because the people who used them left no written account of what happened there. The building was almost certainly religious. The layout suggests ritual activity conducted by specialists rather than public ceremony involving large crowds. But the specific practices, the words spoken and the objects used, and the meanings assigned to what happened in those corridors, exist only in the silence of the brick. The civilization that built the defufa was called Kerma. We do not know what the people who built it called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke among themselves, in their homes and their markets and their royal ceremonies. What we have is the city itself. Kerma was the capital of the first major indigenous state in sub-Saharan Africa, whose physical remains have been identified and studied in detail. Not a trading post, not a ceremonial center used seasonally, a capital city, a place where people lived year-round in large numbers, where a royal court was maintained, where craft production was organized on a scale that required specialized labor. The site was first brought to serious scholarly attention by the American archaeologist George Reisner, who excavated there in the early 20th century. Reisner was meticulous in his fieldwork, but he concluded that Kerma must have been an Egyptian administrative outpost, not a Nubian city, not evidence of indigenous African complexity. He was wrong. It took Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet, who began new excavations at Kerma in 1977 and has continued working there for most of the decades since, to establish what Kerma actually was. The picture that has emerged from Bonnet's work is of an entirely indigenous urban centre, developed by local people over many centuries, with its own distinctive material culture that is clearly different from Egyptian material culture in ways that reflect a genuinely different social and cosmological tradition. The Kerma culture developed over a long period, conventionally divided into three phases. Early Kerma, from roughly 3000 to 2500 BCE. Middle Kerma, from 2500 to about 2000 BCE. And Classic Kerma, from roughly 2000 to approximately 1500 BCE. These dates continue to be refined as new evidence accumulates. Now look at what the royal burials tell us, because they tell us something that no Egyptian parallel can explain. The largest graves in the Kerma cemetery are enormous earthen tumuli, mounds of piled earth reaching diameters of 90 meters or more, visible from considerable distances across the flat terrain around them, which was almost certainly part of their purpose. Royal power in the ancient world expressed itself through scale, through the capacity to mobilize labor and resources on a scope that ordinary people could not approach. What was found inside those tumuli when excavated was remarkable and disturbing in equal measure. The royal burials at Kerma included sacrificial burials on a scale that has no parallel in ancient Egypt. Hundreds of people were buried around the primary royal burial in the largest tumuli, people who appear to have been killed specifically to accompany the ruler into death, placed in the burial chamber while still alive, in a sleeping position, and died as the chamber was sealed. The number of accompanying burials in the largest tumuli reaches into the hundreds. This practice has no direct equivalent in Egyptian royal burial tradition. It is entirely Kerma's own. The ruler was understood to be a figure of such cosmic importance that the deaths of hundreds of people were an appropriate accompaniment to his transition from one form of existence to another. That is not the behavior of a society imitating ideas imported from somewhere else. That is a fully developed ideology of royal power with its own internal logic. The material culture of Kerma reflects the same independence. Kerma pottery is instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with it. The classic Kerma beaker, a thin-walled ceramic vessel with a distinctive tulip shape, burnished to a black top and a reddish body, was produced in enormous quantities and reached a level of technical refinement that any tradition of craft production would be proud of. It looks nothing like Egyptian pottery of the same period. This is not an imitation tradition. It is a fully realized local tradition, with its own aesthetic values and its own technical standards. The economy sustaining this city rested on two foundations. Agriculture first. The broad, fertile plain of the Dongola Reach supported grain production and cattle herding on a significant scale. The cattle were not merely economic assets. The large numbers of cattle skulls found in Kerma burials reflect their importance as markers of status and wealth, embedded in a symbolic system that was distinctly Nubian. Trade second. Kerma sat at a critical junction in the network of routes connecting the African interior to Egypt and through Egypt to the broader ancient world. Gold from the eastern desert, ivory from elephant hunting territories further south, tropical hardwoods and resins and exotic animals. All of these goods moved through Kerma, and the rulers of Kerma controlled that movement and grew rich from it. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt during this long period shifted between trade and tension, and occasional outright conflict across nearly 1,500 years. During Egypt's periods of strength, Egyptian forces pushed south and built fortresses along the Nile. During Egypt's periods of weakness, Kerma pushed back. During the period scholars call the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1700 to 1500 BCE, Egypt fragmented under the pressure of the Hyksos, a people from the Near East who established control over Lower Egypt. This fragmentation gave Kerma an extraordinary opportunity. With Egypt divided and weakened, Kerma expanded northward. The fortress at Buin, which Egypt had built as a monument to its dominance over the Nubian frontier, fell into Kerma's hands. Egyptian statues that had stood in Nubian temples were taken to Kerma, where they were deliberately deposited in burial contexts. A statement about whose power was real and whose monuments were now trophies. That was not the behavior of a dependent periphery. The reversal came when the Egyptian 17th and 18th dynasties reunified Egypt and began a systematic campaign pushing south. The process of Egyptian reconquest unfolded over multiple reigns. Ahmose, who expelled the Hyksos from the north, began campaigns into Nubia. Thutmose, the first, penetrated deep into Nubian territory, reaching and passing the Fourth Cataract, decisively shifting the military balance. Subsequent pharaohs continued the pressure southward, and under Thutmose III, around 1450 BCE, Egyptian forces completed the subjugation of Kerma territory and dismantled the political structure that had sustained the kingdom for more than 1,000 years. The city was burned. The Kerma kingdom, in the form it had maintained across those centuries, came to an end. But the people did not disappear. The culture did not vanish overnight. What followed was a long and complicated process of absorption and transformation, of Egyptian colonization, layered over a Nubian population that retained its own practices and identities in ways that the Egyptian colonial administration never fully controlled. For more than 1,000 years, a civilization flourished in the Middle Nile Valley that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated societies in the ancient world during its time. It built a city. It developed distinctive craft traditions. It organized agricultural production and long-distance trade across hundreds of miles. It maintained a royal ideology of genuine power. It challenged Egypt militarily during Egypt's moments of weakness and held its own against one of the most powerful states in the ancient world for the better part of a millennium. Almost nobody knows its name. The Defufa still stands, rising above the flat plain near the modern town of Kerma, that patient massive presence of mud brick that has outlasted everything around it. The cemetery tumuli are still visible on the landscape, their scale reduced by millennia of erosion, but still readable as monuments of power. The river runs past them, a few miles to the east, carrying its water north as it has always carried it. They do not apologize for what they are. They simply stand there, in the desert, in the light, waiting for the story to catch up with what they have always known. Chapter 5. Egypt looks south. Conquest, tribute, and the long shadow. Something is happening in a temple in what is now southern Egypt. Sometime in the 13th century BCE, the temple is cut directly into a sandstone cliff. Its facade features 4 enormous seated figures, each roughly 20 meters tall, carved from the living rock and left in place. The faces of those figures belong to one man, the same face, 4 times, staring south across the flat desert terrain toward the territory that Egypt has spent the better part of 3 centuries trying to fully control. The man is Ramesses II. The temple is Abu Simbel, and it is standing in Nubia, built in a landscape that was already ancient when the first stone was cut, built to make a specific argument to the people who lived nearby. The argument was made in the only language that monumental architecture speaks. You are here, I am here, and the size of what I have built tells you which one of us is in charge. Let that image sit for a moment before moving forward. 4 identical faces staring south, the sun moving across them through the day, changing the shadows, never changing the expression, patient, absolute, certain of its own permanence. Egypt's approach to governing its southern territories during the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 to 1000 BCE, was built around a figure called the Viceroy of Kush, an Egyptian official appointed by the Pharaoh, responsible for administering the entire region between the first and fourth cataracts of the Nile. The title in Egyptian translates roughly as the King's Son of Kush, signaling the intimacy and the importance of the position. The Viceroy's responsibilities included collecting tribute that Egypt extracted from Nubia, which was enormous and varied. Gold above everything else, produced from mines in the eastern desert and from alluvial deposits along the Nile. Cattle by the thousands, driven north to feed the Egyptian population and supply temple estates. Grain from the agricultural zones of the Nile Valley. Exotic goods from further south. Enslaved people, large numbers of them, incorporated into the Egyptian labor force and into Egyptian households and into the armies Egypt deployed across its empire. The scale of this extraction was significant. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period provide detailed accounts of Nubian tribute in quantities that reflect a systematic and sustained effort to transfer the wealth of the south into the hands of the Egyptian state and its elites. The temples of Amun at Karnak, which grew during this period into one of the largest religious complexes ever built, were funded in part by Nubian gold and Nubian labor. That is an uncomfortable truth worth sitting with. The monuments of the New Kingdom were built with resources extracted from a conquered people who did not choose to provide them. The interior of the Great Temple at Abu Simbel penetrates deep into the cliff, with successive halls aligned so that twice a year At the spring and autumn equinoxes, sunlight penetrates all the way to the innermost sanctuary and illuminates the statues of the gods seated there. The engineering of this alignment is precise. It was not accidental, a statement, in stone and light and mathematics, that the pharaoh who built this place had mastered the relationship between human construction and cosmic order. That statement was being made in a landscape that already had its own traditions for expressing exactly that kind of relationship. And the Nubian populations who lived around these temples did not experience them purely as monuments of domination. They visited them. They made offerings at them. They incorporated the Egyptian deities enshrined in them into their own religious lives, but in ways shaped by their own traditions and their own understanding of what those deities meant. This is the dynamic that makes the history of Nubia under Egyptian occupation genuinely complex and genuinely interesting. Amun, the great god of Thebes, who was the chief deity of the Egyptian imperial project, was promoted throughout Nubia as part of the ideological apparatus of occupation. But the Nubian understanding of Amun was not identical to the Egyptian understanding of Amun. In Egypt, Amun was typically depicted as a human figure with a distinctive, double-plumed crown. In Nubia, Amun was frequently depicted as a ram, or as a human figure with a ram's head. The ram form had deep roots in Nubian religious tradition, connected to local traditions of sacred animals and divine symbolism that predated Egyptian contact. What was happening was not simple adoption, it was transformation. The Nubians were taking an Egyptian deity and reshaping him to fit their own cosmological framework, keeping the name and the general association with divine kingship, while giving the form a distinctly Nubian character. This capacity for creative transformation, rather than passive adoption, is one of the most important things to understand about Nubian culture under Egyptian occupation. They did not simply resist everything Egyptian and preserve their pre-conquest culture unchanged. They could not. The power differential was too great. But they did not simply become Egyptian either. What they became was something that had Egyptian elements incorporated into a fundamentally Nubian framework. Something that looked Egyptian on the surface, in ways that satisfied the administrators and priests who needed to see the forms of imperial culture maintained. While operating according to a different underlying logic, there is a specific site that illustrates this dynamic more clearly than any abstract description can. Jebel Barkal is a sandstone mountain that rises dramatically from the flat plain of the Nile near the Fourth Cataract. The mountain has a distinctive pinnacle on its southern end that, from certain angles, resembles the uraeus, the rearing cobra. That was one of the most powerful symbols of Egyptian royal authority. The Egyptians who came to this region noticed this resemblance. They identified Jebel Barkal as the dwelling place of Amun, a specific and particularly powerful manifestation of the god. And they built temples at the base of the mountain dedicated to this Amun of Jebel Barkal. Timothy Kendall's decades of research at Jebel Barkal have helped support the view that the mountain likely held local sacred significance before Egyptian formalization. The Egyptians did not bring sacredness to this mountain. They arrived at a place that the local tradition had already recognized as significant, and they gave that significance a new name. And later, after Egyptian political power in Nubia had faded, the Nubian kings, who built their own kingdom at Napatan, drew their legitimacy explicitly from the Amun of Jebel Barkal. They presented themselves as the true servants of this god, more authentic in their relationship to him than the Egyptians who had introduced his name. They used the Egyptian religious language they had inherited from the occupation and turned it into an argument for Nubian sovereignty. The tools of the colonizer, taken up, transformed, and used to justify overthrowing the colonizer. That process took centuries, and it required a specific set of historical circumstances to create the opening. During the reign of Ramesses II, and his immediate successors. Egyptian imperial power in Nubia was at its height, but by the end of the 20th dynasty, in the late 12th and early 11th centuries BCE, Egypt was entering a long decline that historians call the Third Intermediate Period. The unified state was fragmenting. The pharaoh's ability to project power southward into Nubia was contracting. The Egyptian grip on Nubia loosened. Egyptian officials withdrew northward. The temples they had built remained, staffed by increasingly local priesthoods that mixed Egyptian and Nubian personnel and practices. In that loosening, something began to grow. In the region around Jebel Barkal and the Fourth Cataract, a community was consolidating that would eventually produce the most extraordinary reversal in the entire history of Nubian-Egyptian relations. Not a community defined by resistance to Egypt, partly defined, paradoxically, by a profound engagement with Egyptian culture. A community that had absorbed Egyptian religious practices and artistic traditions and the concept of divine kingship, and had made all of those things deeply and genuinely its own. A community whose kings would eventually look at a fragmented and weakened Egypt and conclude that the proper servants of the Amun of Jebel Barkal should be the ones sitting on the pharaoh's throne. That conclusion was not simply ambition. It was a theological argument about who was legitimate in the eyes of the god, about who had the right relationship with the sacred mountain and the sacred river and the cosmic order those things represented. The shadow that Egypt cast over Nubia was long and deep and real. The four faces of Ramesses still stare south from the cliff at Abu Simbel, still patient, still certain, but shadows go in two directions, and the shadow that Nubia was about to cast over Egypt would, for roughly half a century, be the shadow of complete political control. The river runs past Jebel Barkal, a few miles to the west, moving north as it always moves. It does not know what is about to happen. It simply carries what it carries, in the direction it has always carried it, toward the sea. Chapter 6. The Gods of the South. Dawn at a temple in what is now northern Sudan. The light arrives from the east, as it always does. But here, it arrives differently than it does in most places. The desert air holds no moisture to soften the transition from darkness to full brightness. One moment, the sandstone walls are grey and unreadable. The next moment, they are fully themselves, warm orange-red in the early light, and the carved figures on their surfaces emerge as if they have been waiting all night for exactly this moment. A god stands on the south wall. His body is that of a man, broad-shouldered and formal in the posture of divinity. But his head is the head of a lion, not a stylized lion, not a symbol reaching for an abstraction, something that was understood in the world that made this image as genuinely present, genuinely powerful, genuinely to be reckoned with. The lion was real in this landscape. It lived in the savannah and along the river margins. It was a presence that the communities of the Nile, south of the First Cataract, had lived alongside and feared and revered for millennia. A warrior deity who expressed divine power through the form of a lion was not reaching for an abstract symbol. He was reaching for the most vivid and immediate embodiment of dangerous power that the natural world provided. His name is Apedemak. He has no Egyptian equivalent. He does not appear in Egyptian religious texts in any significant way. He was not borrowed from the north. He grew from the specific religious imagination of the Nubian world, from a tradition that predated Egyptian contact and that Egyptian occupation never erased. This is where this chapter begins. Not with borrowed gods, with a god that belongs entirely to the south. To understand ancient Nubian religion, you have to begin by unlearning the assumption that everything the Nubian world believed about the divine was learned from Egypt. Some things were learned from Egypt. Many things were not. And the things that were learned were transformed in the learning, reshaped to carry meanings that the Egyptian original never carried. The Temple of Apedemak, at the site of Naka, in what is now central Sudan, built during the Meroitic period, around the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, is among the best preserved ancient structures in Sudan. Its facade shows the lion-headed god receiving offerings from the Meroitic king and queen. The relief carvings on that facade are among the most vivid surviving examples of ancient Nubian religious art. Look at those carvings, and what you see is a coherent and fully realized vision of how the world was organized. A vision that did not need Egypt to give it authority. A vision that was complete in itself. Now move to the god that connected Nubia most deeply to Egypt. Because the connection is real, and the transformation of it is the most revealing thing about Nubian religious identity. Amun. The name is Egyptian. The association with divine, creative power and with legitimate kingship is Egyptian in its formal expression. But the form Amun took in Nubian religious practice was not Egyptian. In Egypt, Amun was typically depicted as a human figure wearing a crown of 2 tall feathers, seated on a throne, majestic and remote. In Nubia, Amun was the ram, consistently and prominently across the entire sweep of Nubian religious art and architecture from the New Kingdom period through the later Meroitic centuries. Ram-headed sphinxes lined the processional avenues of Nubian temples in a way that had no precise equivalent in Egyptian practice. The ram itself, with its curved horns and its patient, massive presence, was the form through which divine power was most naturally and most deeply expressed in Nubian religious tradition. Why the ram? The answer requires going further back than the Egyptian contact, to the indigenous religious traditions of the Nubian Nile Valley that predated any Egyptian influence. Cattle and rams were central to the symbolic and ritual life of the communities along the Nile, south of the First Cataract, long before Egypt arrived. The large numbers of cattle skulls in Kerma burial contexts reflect the cosmic significance of these animals in a genuinely local tradition. The ram, in particular, carried associations with fertility and divine potency, and the kind of power that was generative rather than merely destructive. When Egyptian religious forms arrived in Nubia during the New Kingdom period, bringing the concept of Amun as the supreme divine force underlying kingship, the local population recognized in Amun something that resonated with their own existing sense of where divine power resided. And they expressed that resonance through the animal form their own tradition had already associated with cosmic potency. The result was an Amun who was Egyptian in name and in his connection to royal legitimacy, but Nubian in his most fundamental visual expression. An Amun standing at the intersection of 2 traditions, carrying both without fully belonging to either. This was not compromise. It was synthesis, a genuine integration of 2 ways of understanding divine power into something that was more than either source tradition could have produced alone. There is another aspect of Nubian religious life that deserves specific attention, because it reflects something in the indigenous tradition that Egyptian influence never displaced: the role of the Queen Mother. In the Napatan and Meroitic periods, the mother of the king held a religious and political status that had no real equivalent in Egyptian practice. She appears in temple reliefs at roughly the same scale as the king himself. She participates in royal ritual in ways that Egyptian queens of comparable periods did not. She could, in some periods, function as an independent political actor in ways that the Egyptian system did not accommodate for women who were not themselves pharaoh. This prominent role reflects something in the indigenous Nubian social structure that persisted through all the Egyptian influence and all the formal adoption of Egyptian royal ideology. Some scholars have connected it to elements in the Nubian succession tradition, where descent through the female line played a role in establishing royal legitimacy. The details are debated and the evidence is incomplete. But the pattern across multiple centuries of royal imagery is too consistent to be accidental. The gods of the south were not the gods of Egypt, even when they shared names. The specific combination of Aphrodite, the lion god, and the ram-headed Amun, and the divinely powerful Queen Mother, reflects a cosmological framework that grew from the specific soil of the Nile Valley, south of the First Cataract, shaped by a specific landscape and a specific history and a specific set of questions about what the world was made of and how it should be organized. That framework outlasted the Egyptian occupation. It outlasted the Napatan conquest of Egypt. It persisted through the long centuries of the later Nubian kingdom, absorbing new influences from the Hellenistic world and from the trade routes that connected the Middle Nile to Arabia and the Mediterranean, transforming as it had always transformed, remaining recognizably Nubian through all of it. The last temples built in this tradition were still being constructed and still being used in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. The religious tradition those temples represented was ancient by any measure when it finally faded under the pressure of the new faith moving south from Egypt. It had lasted, in one form or another, for more than 3,000 years. Stand at the temple of Aphrodite at Nuka as the morning advances, which is what archaeologists working at that site have the opportunity to do. And what you see on the walls is not the past, it is a presence, a specific and coherent vision of the world that does not apologize for existing and does not ask permission to be understood. The lion-headed god receives his offerings on the south wall, patient and enormous, his presence unchanged by the passage of 2,000 years. The river runs past this place a few miles to the west, moving north, carrying everything it carries, as it has always carried it. Chapter 7. The Napatan Kingdom and the Black Pharaohs. A king is kneeling, not in defeat, in ritual. He is at the foot of the sacred mountain, at the base of the sandstone cliff, where the priests of Amun have maintained their presence for generations, performing the act of submission to the divine that legitimate kingship in this tradition required, before it could claim any authority at all. His name is Qustul. He is the ruler of Napata, the kingdom that has been consolidating around the Fourth Cataract and the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal for several generations. And what he is doing at this moment, in the mid-8th century BCE, is the theological foundation for everything that follows. He is demonstrating that his authority comes from the god, not from conquest, though conquest will come, not from inheritance alone, though the lineage matters, from the proper relationship with the divine power dwelling in the mountain that the Nubian tradition had recognized as significant long before any pharaoh built a temple there. That argument, made through ritual rather than words, is the most important single idea in the entire Napatan political tradition. Remember it. It explains nearly everything about what comes next. Egypt, in the mid-8th century BCE, was not the unified imperial power that had once built Abu Simbel and stationed its viceroy along the Nubian Nile. The Third Intermediate Period had fragmented it thoroughly. Different dynasties claimed authority over different regions. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak governed Upper Egypt with quasi-royal power, while the nominal pharaohs ruled from the delta. Local rulers across the country maintained their positions through personal influence and military capacity rather than through any coherent system of legitimate authority flowing from a single center. What Egypt had lost, in other words, was exactly what Qustul and his successors were claiming to have preserved: the proper relationship with Amun, the legitimate basis for rule. Qustul extended Napatan influence northward into Egyptian territory in the years of his reign. The precise details of how far north that influence reached are matters of ongoing scholarly work. What is established is that when his son Pa came to the throne, the foundation for a larger campaign had been laid. Now, Pa, the date of his accession, is placed by many scholars at approximately 747 BCE, though the chronology of the 25th dynasty is one of the more genuinely contested areas of ancient Near Eastern scholarship, with researchers working from different reconstructions proposing dates that vary considerably from one another. The uncertainty reflects real gaps in the surviving evidence, rather than minor disagreements about details. What is not in debate is who he was. Pa grew up at Napata, in the shadow of the sacred mountain, in a court that had been absorbing and transforming Egyptian religious learning for generations. He had the full Egyptian scribal education. He could read and write hieroglyphics with the fluency of a man raised inside that tradition. He understood the theology of Amun in precise and detailed terms. He understood Egyptian royal ideology from the inside, not as an observer, but as someone who had been shaped by it since childhood. And he understood it in a way that the competing pharaohs in the fragmented north had perhaps forgotten how to understand it. He understood it as a genuine relationship with a god, not as a political performance, not as a useful set of symbols, as a real obligation, binding in both directions, requiring specific behavior and specific reverence and specific restraint. That understanding shapes the document that brings him closest to us across the centuries. The victory stele. It is a large stone inscription that Pa had erected at Jebel Barkal after his campaign into Egypt, recording the events of that campaign in more narrative detail than almost any comparable ancient royal document. And it is unusual in a way that deserves a moment of attention before the campaign itself. Most royal inscriptions of this era are triumphalist documents. They record victories in the most favorable possible light, suppress complications and failures, present the ruler as a figure of unbroken divine favor and military success. The victory stele contains something different. It records Pa's anger at some of his own generals who violated ritual purity requirements during the campaign. He refused to eat with them afterward, not because they had failed militarily, because they had failed religiously. And to Pa, those failures were the same category of thing. He records his refusal to enter the city of Memphis until he had purified himself properly according to religious protocol. He records his insistence on performing the correct rituals at each city he enters, regardless of the military urgency around him. A man who writes his own anger into his own victory monument is a man with a complicated relationship to the idea of victory. He is not interested in the appearance of perfect triumph. He is interested in whether he actually did things the right way. The campaign itself began in response to the actions of a ruler named Tefnucht, who was expanding his power from the western delta southward into Upper Egypt, threatening to unite enough of the fragmented country under his control to constitute a genuine rival to Napatan ambitions. Pa marched north. What followed was a complex political and military operation in which Pa dealt with multiple competing powers simultaneously. The city of Hermopolis resisted and was besieged. Memphis, the ancient capital and one of the most symbolically important cities in Egypt, was taken by assault from the river. Pa's forces scaled the walls, while others came by boat. The victory stele records that when Pa finally entered Memphis, his first act was not to loot the palace. He went to the temple. He purified himself. He made offerings to the local form of the god Ptah. He performed the ritual acts that a legitimate pharaoh was expected to perform upon entering a major city. He was not conquering Egypt. He was, in his own understanding, restoring it. That distinction mattered to him in a way that shows through the text. He accepts the submission of the various Egyptian rulers who kneel before him. He receives tribute. He makes appointments. And then, having done what he came to do, he returns to Napata. He does not stay in Egypt to govern it directly. He goes home to the mountain and the river and the tradition that made him. This decision has been debated for generations. Was it a missed opportunity? A deliberate theological statement? A practical recognition that holding Egypt from the south would require resources he did not have? The sources do not resolve it cleanly. What they show is a man whose primary orientation was always toward the god, toward the mountain, toward the relationship that had given his dynasty its legitimacy in the first place. Pa was succeeded by his brother Shabaka, who took a more direct approach. Shabaka moved the political center of gravity northward, establishing himself at Memphis and governing Egypt as a resident pharaoh. He initiated a program of temple restoration and building that expressed his dynasty's commitment to Egyptian religious tradition while maintaining the specifically Nubian elements of their royal identity. The art produced during what scholars call the 25th dynasty is one of the places where the synthesis is most visible and most remarkable. Royal statuary of this period shows faces that are clearly different from the stylized Egyptian royal physiognomy of earlier centuries, more naturalistic in their treatment of individual features, reflecting the ancestry of rulers who came from further south along the Nile. At the same time, the formal conventions of Egyptian royal art are maintained with precision. The pose, the regalia, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, the relationship between the royal image and the divine symbols surrounding it, all follow Egyptian conventions exactly. What you are seeing is confident synthesis, a dynasty that was simultaneously and genuinely Egyptian in its cultural formation and aware of its own specifically Nubian identity, holding both without apology, without contradiction. Because for these kings, there was no contradiction. They were buried not in Egypt, but in Sudan, in pyramid tombs at the sites of El Kuru and Nuri near Jebel Barkal. Their pyramids were steeper and smaller than the classic Egyptian pyramids of the Old Kingdom, reflecting a specifically Nubian tradition of pyramid building that had been developing independently. They went home to the mountain when they died. They maintained the connection to their homeland through everything. This dual identity, fully Egyptian and fully Nubian simultaneously, is one of the most remarkable achievements of the 25th dynasty. They demonstrated that the categories were not mutually exclusive, that a civilization could absorb the forms of another civilization without losing its own identity, that the process of cultural exchange running between Nubia and Egypt for 2,000 years had produced something genuinely new and genuinely complex, something with roots reaching back to the age when Egyptian kingship itself was taking shape. That demonstration was about to face the most severe test it could receive, because while the 25th dynasty was consolidating its rule over Egypt and building its temples and making its arguments in stone, another empire was expanding from the northeast with a military capacity and a political ruthlessness that nothing in the Nile Valley was prepared to confront. The Assyrians were coming, and the Pharaoh who would stand at that collision point, who would appear in the Hebrew Bible and in bronze in the museums of Europe, and whose pyramid still rises from the desert at Nuri, was already a young man in the court at Memphis, learning what it meant to govern a civilization that was not quite done becoming itself. His name was Taharqa. The river runs past Jebel Barkal in the early evening, turning briefly gold before the light leaves it entirely, and the mountain becomes a silhouette against the darkening sky. The god in the mountain waits, as the god in the mountain has always waited. Tomorrow, as it has always done, the light will return. Chapter 8. Taharqa, the pharaoh the Bible remembers. A bronze head sits in a museum in Europe. It came there as a trophy, taken from Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, where it had been placed after being removed from wherever it originally stood in Egypt or Nubia. The Assyrians collected the images of the rulers they defeated. A practical kind of record-keeping, a physical argument about who had won and what that winning meant. The face on that bronze is specific in the way that faces are specific when an artist is working from life or from careful observation rather than from convention. The features are those of a man from the Nubian tradition, depicted with a naturalism that the idealized conventions of Egyptian royal portraiture did not always allow. The eyes hold a quality of steady attention. The jaw carries the set of someone who has already faced the worst and decided how to carry it without allowing it to change what he is. His name was Taharqa. He was born in Nubia, the son of Pa. Raised in the tradition of the Napatan court, with its extraordinary synthesis of Egyptian religious learning and Nubian royal identity. He came to Egypt as a young man during the reign of his uncle, Shebitku. Sent north to take command of military forces at a moment when the situation in the eastern Mediterranean was becoming genuinely dangerous. He was crowned pharaoh at approximately 690 BCE. Though the specific chronology of the later 25th dynasty is one of the more debated areas of ancient Near Eastern scholarship, with researchers including Kenneth Kitchen and Daniel Kahn proposing different reconstructions of the sequence and the dates. The uncertainty is worth naming rather than obscuring. What is not in dispute is what Taharqa did once he held power. He built, extensively and with evident intention, he added a colonnade to the entrance of the Great Temple at Karnak, a row of enormous columns that, even in their ruined state, give some sense of the scale he was working at. He built at Memphis and at Thebes and at sites across Egypt and Nubia. He conducted restoration of older temples that had fallen into disrepair, presenting himself explicitly as the pharaoh who was healing what had been broken, restoring the divine order that Egypt's centuries of fragmentation had disrupted. Egyptian records, from the early years of his reign, report unusually high Nile floods, which in the agricultural world of the ancient Nile Valley meant unusually abundant harvests. The texts present these floods as divine favor, as evidence that the god approved of the king on the throne. His early reign carried an atmosphere of prosperity and divine sanction that made the 25th dynasty's claim to legitimate rule feel as secure as it had ever felt. And then the Assyrians arrived. The Assyrian Empire, under the kings of its late period, was the most formidable military machine the ancient Near East had yet produced. Built explicitly around conquest, organized at the institutional level for the efficient projection of military force over long distances. Its armies used iron weapons at a time when bronze was still common elsewhere. Its siege technology was the most advanced in the world, capable of reducing walled cities that earlier armies would have had to bypass or starve out over years. Its administrative system was designed to extract maximum tribute from conquered territories while maintaining enough order to keep those territories economically productive. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt in 671 BCE. He defeated Taharqa's forces in a series of battles that drove the Nubian pharaoh out of Memphis and southward toward Upper Egypt. Esarhaddon captured Memphis, looted it, and took members of Taharqa's family as prisoners back to Assyria. He erected a victory stele, depicting himself holding Egyptian captives by ropes attached to rings through their lips. The standard Assyrian imagery for total conquest. He then left Egypt, leaving Assyrian-appointed governors in place and returning north to Nineveh. What happened next says something important about the limits of even the most powerful military force when it is operating far from its home base. Taharqa came back. Within 2 years of Esarhaddon's withdrawal, Taharqa had retaken Memphis and was reasserting 25th dynasty control over much of Egypt. The Assyrian governors were expelled or killed. The Nubian pharaoh was back on his throne. Esarhaddon prepared a second invasion, but died before he could launch it. In 669 BCE, his son Assurbanipal completed what his father had planned. Assurbanipal invaded Egypt, defeated Taharqa again, and pushed him south. This time, the Assyrian withdrawal was managed differently. Rather than relying on governors who could be expelled, Assurbanipal cultivated local Egyptian rulers as client kings, men with their own interest in maintaining Assyrian backing because their position depended on it. Taharqa died at approximately 664 BCE, in exile at Meroe. Having spent the final years of his reign struggling to maintain a hold on Egypt that the Assyrian military advantage had made increasingly impossible to sustain. Sit with that for a moment before the story moves forward. A man who had built temples across Egypt and Nubia, who had presided over floods that his people read as divine favor, who had retaken Memphis from the most powerful empire in the world through sheer determination, who had governed one of the largest political entities in the ancient world, died in exile in the city of his ancestors, far from the throne he had fought to keep. That is not a small thing to carry. His successor, Tutankhamun, made one more attempt to reclaim Egypt, initially with some success, before the Assyrian response drove the 25th dynasty out permanently. In 663 BCE, the Assyrian army sacked Thebes, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt and the city of Amun, stripping it of treasures accumulated over centuries. The 25th dynasty was over. The Nubian pharaohs would never again rule Egypt. That is the military and political summary, and it is incomplete, because it leaves out the dimension of this story that makes Taharqa something more than a defeated king. The Hebrew Bible mentions him by name. In the second book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 9, and in the book of Isaiah, chapter 37, verse 9, the same event is recorded. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who preceded Esarhaddon and who had been campaigning in the Levant against the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, received word that Taharqa, the king of Kush, was marching to make war against him. Taharqa is Taharqa. The identification is not seriously disputed among scholars, though the specific chronology of the events described raises complications that historians continue to work through carefully. And the dating questions in this period of ancient Near Eastern history are genuinely complex. The context in the biblical text is everything. Sennacherib was besieging Jerusalem. The Judean king Hezekiah was in the temple, praying in the specific and desperate way that people pray when they genuinely cannot see a way out of the situation they are in. The prophet Isaiah delivered an oracle, saying that Sennacherib would not take Jerusalem and would return to his own land. And then word came that Taharqa was moving against Assyria. In the biblical narrative, Sennacherib's campaign ended without Jerusalem falling. Modern historians have various explanations for what actually happened, ranging from epidemic disease in the Assyrian camp to strategic calculations that made the siege of Jerusalem less valuable than returning north. The details remain genuinely debated among scholars. But Taharqa appears in this narrative as a force of sufficient military credibility that his approach was a factor in the calculations of both Sennacherib and the Judean king he was besieging. He was not a peripheral figure in the geopolitics of the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. He was one of the major players, a king whose movements mattered to the kingdoms of the Levant and to the empire that was threatening them. The Hebrew Bible was written and compiled over centuries, preserved and transmitted through Jewish and then Christian tradition, and it remains one of the most widely read texts in human history. More people have encountered Taharqa through that single verse than through any Egyptological or Nubian studies textbook. He exists in the consciousness of hundreds of millions of people who have read the Bible or heard it read. most of them without knowing that the king of Kush, mentioned in that verse, was the ruler of a civilization that had governed Egypt for half a century and had its roots in a tradition reaching back thousands of years along the Nile. That gap between what the verse says and what most readers of it know is itself a small lesson in how history gets selectively preserved. Now consider why Taharqa lost. Because the answer is more complicated than military technology alone. The Assyrians were fighting with supply lines that, while long, ran through territory they largely controlled or could coerce. The 25th dynasty was fighting at the extreme end of a logistical chain stretching from Napatan in northern Sudan to the delta of Egypt, a distance of more than 1,000 miles. Maintaining armies and supply lines across that distance was a structural challenge that no military advantage could entirely overcome. The Assyrians had also spent a decade refining their techniques against Near Eastern states that had been preparing for their arrival for years. And the 25th dynasty never fully consolidated the allegiance of all the local Egyptian rulers whose cooperation they needed. The client kings, who accepted Assyrian backing, had their own reasons for doing so that had nothing to do with Nubian legitimacy or its absence. None of this diminishes what the 25th dynasty achieved. It maintained Nubian rule over Egypt for roughly half a century in a period when Egypt was being contested by the most powerful military force in the western half of the ancient world. Taharqa was defeated, and the civilization that produced him was not. His pyramid stands at Nuri, across the Nile from Jebel Barkal, in the desert where the royal Napatan dead were buried, considerably eroded from its original height, but still present, still readable as a monument of power in a landscape that does not easily give up its monuments. The bronze head in the European Museum looks out across the distance between then and now. Steady, specific, the face of a man who stood at the intersection of the most powerful forces in the ancient world and did not look away from any of them. The river ran past his pyramid, then as it runs past it now, carrying its water north, indifferent and continuous and present as it has always been present in this landscape. Chapter 9. Meroe, when Nubia stopped looking north. 6 clay vessels sit on a shelf in the Sudan National Museum in Khartoum. They are not grand objects. They do not have the visual impact of the gold jewelry recovered from royal tombs, or the scale of the Defufa at Kerma, or the drama of the pyramids rising from the desert east of Meroe. They are the kind of objects that end up in the sections of museums that tourists walk past quickly on their way to the more obviously impressive rooms. But look at them carefully, and what you see is extraordinary. The painted decoration on their surfaces combines motifs from the Egyptian artistic tradition: the lotus flower, the geometric registers, the careful ordering of visual space, with imagery that has no Egyptian equivalent whatsoever. Figures in specifically Meroitic dress, animals from the savannah south of the Nile, a visual language that is using Egyptian conventions the way a writer might use a borrowed alphabet to write in their own language, deploying the forms of one tradition to say something that tradition never said. These vessels were made by people who had absorbed the Egyptian artistic vocabulary so thoroughly that they could deploy it without self-consciousness, and who were using it to say things that Egypt never said. That is what Meroe was. After the expulsion of the 25th dynasty from Egypt in 663 BCE, the center of gravity of Nubian civilization shifted southward. Not abruptly. The process unfolded over generations, and the Napatan kings continued to be buried near Jebel Barkal for some time, even as Meroe grew in importance as a royal residence and economic center. But by roughly the 4th century BCE, Meroe had become the unambiguous capital of a kingdom that was developing in directions increasingly distinct from the Egyptian-influenced traditions of the earlier Napatan period. The most dramatic evidence of this distinctiveness is the writing. The Napatan tradition had used Egyptian hieroglyphics for royal inscriptions, a practice that reflected the deep Egyptian cultural influence that had shaped Nubian royal tradition from the New Kingdom period onward. Egyptian was the language of religion and of prestige in the Napatan world, even for rulers who spoke a different language among themselves. At some point, almost certainly by the 3rd century BCE and possibly earlier, the Meroitic kingdom began using a new writing system. The Meroitic script used signs derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics, but represented a completely different language. The actual spoken language of the Meroitic population that had been used in daily life throughout the Napatan period, while Egyptian served the formal functions. And here is a detail worth pausing on. Meroitic is a true alphabet, a system in which individual signs represent individual sounds, not pictures standing for words or syllables, as in Egyptian hieroglyphics. That is a significant intellectual and technical achievement in its own right, reflecting the kind of independent linguistic thinking that produces a new writing system from first principles rather than simply borrowing an existing one wholesale. The development of this distinct script is one of the most significant cultural assertions in the history of ancient Nubia. It is a statement that the civilization of the Middle Nile Valley had a language worth writing down, a language that did not need Egyptian as a mediating system. The script comes in two forms: a hieroglyphic version used primarily for monumental inscriptions on temple walls, and a cursive version used for more everyday purposes on papyrus and pottery and other materials, simplified into a flowing alphabetic script of 23 signs. The Meroitic script was deciphered at the level of its sound values in 1911 by the British scholar Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who worked out the phonetic values of the signs by comparing Meroitic inscriptions at known locations with contextually interpretable texts. That decipherment means scholars can now pronounce Meroitic inscriptions with reasonable confidence. Being able to pronounce a text is not the same as being able to understand it. Meroitic remains only partially understood in terms of meaning. For a long time, it was treated as difficult to classify in relation to other language families, though some modern scholars, particularly the linguist Claude Rilly, argue for a connection to the Eastern Sudanic language family, which includes several languages still spoken in Sudan and northeastern Africa today. If this connection can be established on a secure evidential basis, it would provide the comparative framework that previous researchers lacked. This proposal is being actively evaluated in the field. It is not yet a settled conclusion, but the direction of the research is more promising than it has been at any previous point, which is itself worth noting. What this means for now is that the Meroitic people left behind thousands of inscriptions on temple walls and stone monuments and pottery and papyrus, and scholars can read the sounds of those inscriptions without being able to understand most of what they say. A civilization that chose to write its own language down, to assert its own linguistic identity, and to leave behind a substantial written record, is largely silent to us, because the key that would unlock that record has not yet been fully found. The physical remains of Meroe are somewhat more accessible than its texts, and they are remarkable in their own right. The royal city covered a substantial area on the east bank of the Nile. Excavations there have revealed a royal palace complex, temple structures, industrial facilities, and residential areas that together paint a picture of a significant urban centre with the full range of functions you would expect from a capital city. The temples of Meroe show the synthesis of traditions that characterized Meroitic culture at its most distinctive. Egyptian architectural forms were used as the basic vocabulary of temple design, but the decoration on those temples showed a visual language that was specifically Meroitic in its treatment of royal figures and divine imagery. The queens in particular, who appear in Meroitic temple reliefs, at a scale comparable to the king's, carry a quality of formidable physical presence that reflects the genuine political power the Meroitic Queen Mother held. And then there is iron. Meroe was one of the major iron-producing centers in the ancient world. Enormous slag heaps from ancient furnaces have been found near the city site, representing centuries of intensive metallurgical activity. Iron ore was available in the region. Charcoal from acacia forests could fuel the furnaces. The products of those furnaces, iron tools and weapons and agricultural implements, could be traded across the wide network of routes connecting Meroe to its neighbors. The trade networks that Meroe participated in were extensive and connected it to a remarkably wide range of the ancient world. To the north, trade with Egypt continued throughout the Meroitic period. Even after the political relationship between the two civilizations had been fundamentally transformed. To the east, connections to the Arabian Peninsula and through it to the wider trading world of the Indian Ocean. To the south and west, routes, moving goods from the savanna and tropical forest zones northward to where they could enter the Mediterranean trade system. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE, described Meroe as the largest city of the Ethiopians, using that term in the Greek sense, referring to the lands south of Egypt generally. The Roman author Pliny the Elder mentioned it in his encyclopedic survey of the natural world. The Roman Emperor Augustus, after the Roman conquest of Egypt, faced an early test of the new relationship between Rome and its Nubian neighbor when his prefect Gaius Petronius conducted military operations against Meroitic territory in the late 1st century BCE, reportedly in response to Meroitic raids on the Egyptian border. Those military operations were followed by negotiations, and those negotiations resulted in a formal treaty that gave Meroe favorable terms, including the removal of certain tribute obligations that the Romans had initially imposed. A small kingdom on the Roman frontier, negotiating favorable terms with the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean world. That is not the outcome you associate with a civilization at the margins of the ancient world. The figure leading those negotiations on the Meroitic side is identified in the sources as a queen, referred to by the title Candace. The specific identity of this queen is debated among scholars, with several Meroitic queen mothers of this period being possible candidates. But the sources are consistent in identifying a woman in a position of military and political leadership as the principal Meroitic figure in the negotiations. Her name has not been definitively established from the sources that survive, but her presence in those negotiations, and the favorable terms they produced, reflects something that the long history of this civilization had developed across many centuries: the capacity to deal with power on its own terms. The civilization that emerged from the retreat of the 25th dynasty from Egypt was not diminished. It was transformed. It had looked north for long enough. It had absorbed what Egypt had to teach and had spent centuries synthesizing that learning with its own traditions. Now, it was building something that expressed itself in its own script, worshipped its own gods in its own architectural language, smelted its own iron, traded with its own partners from Arabia to the African interior. It had stopped looking north, and in stopping, it had found something it was always moving toward, a way of being entirely and unmistakably itself. The pyramids that the Meroitic kings and queens built above their tombs in the desert east of the city, steeper and smaller than the Egyptian originals, and absolutely their own in what they meant to the people who built them and the people who were placed within them, still stand in the Sudanese desert today, rising from the sand in clusters, their profiles sharp against the sky in the particular way that desert monuments are sharp, where the air is clear and the horizon far, and every vertical thing stands out against the horizontal world. with a clarity that other landscapes do not produce. 6 clay vessels on a museum shelf in Khartoum, painted with borrowed signs saying something entirely their own. The river runs west of the pyramids, just far enough away that you cannot see it from most of the cemetery, though you know it is there, as it has always been there, as it will always be there. Chapter 10. The Pyramids Nobody Talks About. 255. That is the approximate number of pyramid structures that have been identified in Sudan, in the territory of the ancient Nubian kingdoms, across a landscape stretching from the region near the Fourth Cataract in the north to the ancient city of Meroe and beyond in the south. The exact count varies slightly depending on which survey is being referenced and how certain ambiguous structures are classified. And that qualification belongs in the first sentence rather than hidden further down. Now, consider the number most people carry in their minds when they think of pyramids. 138. That is the approximate number of pyramids identified in Egypt. The civilization that the world associates almost exclusively with the pyramid as a form of monumental architecture built fewer of them than the civilization that most of the world has barely heard of. Nubia has more pyramids than Egypt, depending on how structures are counted in both cases, and by a significant margin. That fact is not obscure. It appears in serious archaeological literature. It has been reported in mainstream publications. It is the kind of fact that, once encountered, produces a specific sensation. The sensation of something reorganizing itself in the mind, of a picture that seemed complete, revealing a large section it had left out. Most people have never encountered it. The Nubian pyramids are concentrated in 3 main sites. The oldest royal cemetery is at El Kuru, near Jebel Barkal in northern Sudan, where the early kings of the Napatan dynasty were buried beginning in the 9th or 8th century BCE. Pa was buried here. His father Qustul before him. The pyramid forms at El Kuru show the development of a specifically Nubian pyramid style from the earlier tumulus burial traditions that preceded it. The second major cemetery is at Nuri, across the Nile from Jebel Barkal, where the pyramid of Taharqa is the most prominent structure. Taharqa's pyramid at Nuri originally rose to a height of perhaps 40 meters, with a base of approximately 52 meters on each side. It is steeper than the classic Egyptian pyramid, with sides rising at an angle of roughly 65 to 67 degrees compared to the approximately 52 degrees of the Great Pyramid at Giza. That steeper angle is characteristic of Nubian pyramids generally and gives them a visual character that is immediately distinctive once you know what you are looking at. The third and largest concentration is at Meroe itself, where the cemeteries contain the burials of the Meroitic kings and queens who ruled from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, a span of approximately 600 years. These are the pyramids that visitors to Sudan see in photographs, rising from the desert in the early morning light, with a force that photographs approach but do not fully capture. The Meroitic pyramids are generally smaller than the Napatan ones, and considerably smaller than the classic Egyptian pyramids of the Old Kingdom. Their bases range from roughly 6 to 30 meters on a side. They were built of cut sandstone blocks, with a small mortuary chapel attached to the east face, its walls decorated with relief carvings showing the deceased in the company of gods and receiving offerings. Before talking about what happened to many of those burial chambers, there is a queen who deserves to be known before her tomb becomes part of the story. Her name was Amenemhat. She ruled as Queen of Meroe in the late 1st century BCE. In the period of active diplomatic and military engagement with Rome that produced the treaty discussed in the previous chapter, she was not a queen consort, a woman defined by her relationship to a king. She was a ruling queen, a Candace in the tradition of formidable Meroitic women who held real political and military power in ways that no equivalent tradition in the Mediterranean world quite accommodated. The reliefs that depict Amanishakheto show a woman of commanding physical presence, rendered in the specifically Meroitic style that gave its rulers a scale and solidity quite different from the idealized slenderness of Egyptian royal art. She stands at the same height as the gods receiving her offerings. She wears the elaborate jewelry of Meroitic royal tradition, armlets and necklaces and shield rings, objects that announced her status in the visual language that her civilization had developed over centuries. She was buried with objects made specifically for her. Gold armlets, decorated with imagery from the Meroitic visual tradition, shield rings of extraordinary technical sophistication, necklaces, and other pieces that represent the highest level of craftsmanship that Meroitic goldsmiths achieved across their long tradition. These objects were made for a specific person, made by craftspeople who knew the queen they were serving and who expressed, through the quality of their work, the value they placed on doing that service well. They were placed in her tomb as part of a specific set of beliefs about what death meant and what the dead needed and what the living owed to those who had governed them. They stayed there for nearly 2,000 years. And then Giuseppe Fellini came. Fellini was an Italian physician who had been working in Egypt and who travelled south into Sudanese territory in 1832 under the employment of an Albanian military commander who held authority over the region from the Egyptian government of Muhammad Ali Pasha. He was looking for ancient treasure, the discipline of archaeology as it is now practiced, with its emphasis on careful documentation and contextual preservation, did not yet exist in a form that would have influenced someone in his position. In 1834, Fellini and his workers reached the pyramid cemeteries at Meroe. He had some intelligence that treasure might be found there, or perhaps he simply acted on the general assumption that ancient royal tombs were the most likely places to find valuable objects. What he did is recorded in his own published account, which he wrote after returning to Europe, and which he clearly intended as a triumphant narrative of discovery. He demolished the upper portions of at least 40 pyramids, possibly more, searching for burial chambers and their contents. The demolition was not subtle. He had the upper sections physically broken apart, scattering blocks across the desert surface. The one significant cache of objects he found was in the pyramid of Amanishakheto. The gold jewelry recovered from her burial chamber is acknowledged today as among the masterpieces of ancient goldworking from anywhere in the world. The technical sophistication of the pieces, the refinement of the imagery, the evidence they provide of a craft tradition developed over centuries, places them alongside the finest work of any ancient civilization. These objects are now divided between the Egyptian Museum in Munich, where Fellini sold part of the collection, and the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where another portion eventually arrived. They are displayed in museum cases under controlled lighting. They are studied by scholars. They are admired by visitors who have no idea what was destroyed to find them. The Munich Museum initially doubted the authenticity of the objects Fellini offered them because they could not believe that such sophisticated metalwork could have been produced in the African interior. That skepticism, explicit in the contemporary documentation, tells you something about the assumptions that shaped European engagement with African antiquity in the 19th century. Amanishakheto's jewelry is in Munich and Berlin. Her pyramid is a truncated structure in the Sudanese desert, its upper section missing, its silhouette broken where it should be complete. The damage is visible from a distance, and it is visible in every photograph taken at the site. The pyramids at Meroe that Fellini demolished have not been rebuilt. They stand today as they were left in 1834, a record of what was done there, as clearly as the surviving pyramids are a record of what was built there 2,000 years ago. Some restoration work has been conducted at Meroe and at other Nubian pyramid sites. Undertaken with international cooperation and with the participation of Sudanese institutions. Efforts to stabilize and document the surviving structures continue. They cannot restore what Fellini destroyed. They can only work with what remains. Now step back from the specific damage and look at what the Nubian pyramids represent as a whole. The pyramid building tradition in Nubia lasted for roughly 1,000 years. From the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE, the most active pyramid building period in Egypt. The Old Kingdom lasted roughly 500 years. The Nubian tradition, measured by duration alone, outlasted the most famous period of Egyptian pyramid building by a factor of 2. The tradition was not static across that millennium. It developed, adapted, expressed the specific beliefs and aesthetic values of each period in which it was practiced. A tradition sustained for 1,000 years is not an imitation. It is a living inheritance, continuously renewed, continuously adapted, continuously expressing the specific needs and beliefs of the people maintaining it. 255 pyramids, give or take, depending on how you count, in a desert that the world forgot to look at. Chapter 11. Why Nubia Disappeared from the Story. George Reisner is standing on a mound in northern Sudan in the year 1913. He is a careful man, meticulous. He has brought proper equipment and proper methods, and a proper intention to understand what he is looking at. He is standing on the ruins of one of the most significant urban centers in ancient Africa, in a place that has been accumulating the evidence of a complex and sophisticated civilization for more than 1,000 years. He looks at what is in front of him, and he sees an Egyptian administrative outpost. He is wrong, not because he is careless, because the framework he is using to interpret what he sees cannot accommodate what is actually there. The framework was built on assumptions that made certain conclusions impossible to reach, regardless of what the evidence showed. That image, a skilled and serious scholar, standing on the ruins of something extraordinary and consistently failing to see it for what it was, is the most honest way to begin this chapter. Something can be present and invisible at the same time. Not hidden, not buried, not erased in any physical sense. Simply present in a way that the available frameworks for seeing cannot register. The disappearance of ancient Nubia from the standard account of human civilization was not a simple accident. It was produced by specific forces that operated together over roughly 2 centuries of modern scholarship, each reinforcing the others. None of them requiring conscious malice to produce their cumulative effect. The first force is structural and begins with a genuine asymmetry. Egyptology became a mature academic discipline before Nubian studies did. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 opened the entire world of Egyptian written records to scholarly analysis. Suddenly it was possible to read the texts on temple walls, to work through administrative records and royal inscriptions and private letters that Egyptian civilization had produced in such abundance. Nubia lacked this. The earlier Nubian cultures produced no deciphered writing system for most of their history. The Meroitic script was deciphered at the level of sound values in 1911, but remains largely unreadable in terms of meaning. The result was that the history scholars could write about Egypt was richer, more detailed, and more immediately compelling to general audiences than anything that could be written about Nubia from pottery sequences and grave goods alone. That structural asymmetry is not anyone's fault. It reflects what the two civilizations left behind, but it produced a consistent imbalance in scholarly attention that compounded over generations. The river runs past the places where those imbalances were produced, as it has always run past everything, indifferent and continuous, carrying what it carries, north, The second force is more troubling, because it was not structural but ideological. The academic discipline that studies ancient Egypt and its neighbours developed primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries, in European universities and through European-led expeditions, at a time when European colonial power over Africa was near its peak. The scholars who built the field brought with them the intellectual assumptions of their era, assumptions about racial hierarchy and civilizational development that were deeply wrong and that shaped what those scholars looked for and found significant. The consequences for Nubia were direct and lasting. Scholars who assumed that complex civilization could not have developed indigenously south of Egypt approached Nubian evidence in ways that consistently minimized its independent significance. When they found evidence of sophisticated culture in Nubia, they attributed it to Egyptian influence rather than local development. When they found Nubian art and architecture that resembled Egyptian art and architecture, they described the Nubian versions as imitations rather than considering the possibility that influence might have run in both directions. The Reisner case at Kerma is the most thoroughly documented example, but the pattern it represents ran through the entire field, and it was not corrected until Charles Bonnet began his new excavation program at Kerma in 1977, 60 years after Reisner's original work, and established the indigenous character of Kerma civilization on evidential footing that could no longer be dismissed. 60 years is a long time for a wrong answer to hold. The third force is purely physical and irreversible. The Aswan High Dam, constructed between 1960 and 1970, created a reservoir that submerged an enormous stretch of the Nile Valley, containing some of the most archaeologically significant land in the ancient world. The region around the first and second cataracts, the zone of most intensive Nubian-Egyptian interaction from the earliest periods of contact, is now underwater. The UNESCO Nubian campaign organized an international effort to document and salvage what could be saved before the flooding. Abu Simbel was famously cut apart and reassembled on higher ground. Other monuments were moved to museums, but the salvage was necessarily incomplete. Ordinary sites, the settlements and small cemeteries and agricultural installations that would have told the story of everyday Nubian life across thousands of years, received far less attention than the monumental ones. The knowledge that was in that ground is not waiting for future archaeologists with better technology. It is under 50 meters of water behind a dam that will not be removed. The evidence that might resolve the most important questions about the earliest periods of Nubian history is, to a significant degree, simply gone. The fourth force involves a more recent complication. As Nubian studies began correcting the long bias of the field in the 1970s and 80s, it attracted attention from scholars and advocates motivated by the entirely understandable desire to recover African contributions to world civilization from the dismissal those contributions had received. Some claims made in this context went beyond what the evidence supported. These overcorrections created a secondary problem, giving critics ammunition to dismiss genuine and well-supported advances along with the overclaimed ones. The result was a period of confusion in which legitimate revision of the historical record became entangled with unsupported claims, making it harder for general audiences to understand what was actually established and what was contested. That confusion has not entirely resolved, but the scholarly consensus that has been building since the 1980s, based on archaeological evidence that continues to accumulate, is increasingly clear about the major outlines of ancient Nubian history in ways that do not require exaggeration and do not depend on claims that the evidence cannot support. Ancient Nubia does not need embellishment. What the archaeology actually shows is extraordinary enough on its own terms. A civilization that built urban centers when much of Europe was still organized in small villages. A culture that produced art and gold work and architecture of real sophistication. A series of kingdoms that interacted with Egypt as equals and sometimes as rulers. A tradition of royal power with roots reaching back to the age when Egyptian kingship itself was taking shape. That story does not need overclaiming to be compelling. It needs only to be told. The disappearance of Nubia from the standard historical account was not inevitable. It was produced by specific forces in specific historical circumstances. The colonial bias of 19th and early 20th century scholarship, the physical loss of evidence to the Aswan reservoir, the structural advantage that Egypt's written records gave it in the competition for scholarly attention, the incomplete and sometimes distorting corrections that came in response to the original bias. All of those forces are now being understood and accounted for in ways they were not before. The pyramids in the Sudanese desert were always there. The ruins of Kerma and Meroe and Napatan were always in the ground. The texts on the temple walls were always carved in the sandstone. What changes is not the evidence. What changes is the willingness to look at it honestly and let it tell the story it has always been trying to tell. Chapter 12. What modern archaeology is changing. A team of researchers is working at a site in northern Sudan in the hours before dawn, before the heat makes outdoor work genuinely difficult. They are moving a ground-penetrating radar device slowly across the desert surface in a grid pattern, watching the readings accumulate on a screen that shows what is in the ground without requiring them to dig anything up. They are looking for subsurface structures, walls, pits, the outlines of rooms and corridors that have been invisible since the sand covered them. What they are finding is expanding the known footprint of the site by roughly 40% beyond what previous excavation had established. This kind of discovery, enabled by technology that did not exist even a generation ago, is happening at Nubian sites across Sudan with increasing frequency, and it is changing what scholars understand about the scale, the complexity, and the duration of ancient Nubian civilization in ways that are still being absorbed into the broader historical picture. The last 4 decades have produced more significant revision to what scholars understand about the ancient Nile Valley south of the First Cataract than the previous century and a half of scholarship combined. That is not an exaggeration. It reflects the convergence of new excavation technology, new dating methods, new theoretical frameworks that have allowed researchers to ask better questions, and the growing participation of Sudanese scholars in the study of their own country's past. That last development deserves emphasis. For most of the history of the field, the study of ancient Nubia was conducted by outsiders, European and American and Japanese and other international scholars, working in a country that was the subject of the research but not yet a full partner in it. The growing capacity of Sudanese archaeologists and institutions to lead and direct research in their own country is producing a shift in perspective that is affecting not just what is studied, but how it is interpreted. Scholars who grow up in Sudan, who know the landscape and the communities where the ancient sites are located, who carry cultural knowledge that outside researchers do not naturally carry, ask different questions and notice different things. That is not a romantic claim about indigenous knowledge replacing scientific method. It is a practical observation about how perspective shapes inquiry. And it is a development that the field needed. The Sudan National Museum in Khartoum holds one of the most significant collections of ancient Nubian material in the world. The National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums has been conducting its own excavation programs at sites across the country, generating evidence that is increasingly central to scholarly understanding. At Kerma, Charles Bonnet's long program of excavation has continued producing results that deepen the understanding of the site's development. Work in recent decades has revealed evidence of earlier occupation phases beneath the classic Kerma levels, pushing the history of significant activity at the site back further than previous understanding had established. At the site of Sedainga, on the west bank of the Nile, in northern Sudan, excavations by a French mission have been revealing the burial practices of ordinary Meroitic people, not the royal elite whose monuments have received most of the scholarly attention, but the farmers and craftspeople and traders who made up the vast majority of the population. The Sedainga cemetery contains hundreds of small pyramids and other funerary structures belonging to people of more modest means, and the evidence from these burials is beginning to fill in the picture of what Meroitic society looked like below the level of the royal court. For too long, ancient Nubia was known primarily through its royal monuments. The evidence from Sedainga and similar sites is beginning to provide access to lives that were always there, but never visible in the historical record. The question of the Meroitic language remains one of the most actively pursued problems in the field. The linguist, Claude Rilly, has been developing his proposal for a connection between Meroitic and Eastern Sudanic languages through careful comparative linguistic analysis. The work is ongoing. The scholarly evaluation of it is ongoing. A definitive resolution of the language question would transform what we know about Meroitic civilization in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict in advance. And the field is watching this work with considerable attention. Recent scholarship has also been producing significant results in the area of ancient environmental reconstruction. The landscape that surrounds the ancient sites today is mostly desert. That impression creates the assumption that the ancient sites existed in essentially the same environment that surrounds them today. That assumption is wrong. Research, combining analysis of ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments, isotopic analysis of animal bones from archaeological sites, and geological evidence for ancient watercourses and vegetation patterns has established that the ancient Nubian kingdoms existed in a significantly different climate than the one that prevails in the region today. The period scholars call the African humid period, lasting roughly from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, with regional variations, produced a Sahara that was substantially wetter and more vegetated. Grasslands extended across areas that are now pure desert. For the cattle herding that was so central to Kerma culture, this matters enormously. The scale of herding that the Kerma burial record implies was possible on a landscape that no longer exists in recognizable form. The trade routes that connected Nubia to the African interior moved through terrain that was more accessible in the ancient period than the modern desert suggests. A civilization adapted to a specific environment looks different when you understand that environment accurately, rather than projecting the current landscape onto the past. The field of ancient DNA analysis has been advancing rapidly across archaeology generally. Using genetic material recovered from well-preserved skeletal remains at archaeological sites, it is worth noting that the hot and dry climate of many Nubian sites makes DNA preservation more challenging than in cooler regions, which means data from Nubia specifically remains more limited than from some other parts of the world. But progress is being made, and the genetic evidence emerging from the Nile Valley is beginning to show patterns of movement and interaction between populations over thousands of years with a specificity that was not previously available. This evidence is still being gathered and still being interpreted, and the caution appropriate to any rapidly developing scientific field applies. What all of this means, taken together, is that ancient Nubia is in the process of being recovered, not in the archaeological sense alone, but in the cultural sense of being returned to the story of human civilization from which it was excluded for reasons that had nothing to do with its actual historical significance. The work goes on. The ground still holds its secrets. The river still carries its water north, as it has carried it for longer than human civilization has existed. And, somewhere in the desert of northern Sudan, in the light that arrives each morning with the particular clarity that desert mornings have. The pyramids are still standing, waiting, with the patient immobility of very old things, for the story to catch up with what they have always known. Chapter 13. The river remembers. As an illustration of what this history means in the present, consider something like this. A child is growing up near the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan. She does not know that the mound near her village is a pyramid. Not in the way that the word pyramid carries meaning for the outside world. It is simply there. It has always been there. The way that certain things in a landscape become part of the world through familiarity. It is simply something she has walked past every day of her life. Patient and old and present. When archaeologists come to work near her village, she watches. She carries water. She listens. And one afternoon, an archaeologist pauses and asks her what the mound is called in the local language. She tells him the name. He writes it down. He does not know that the name she has given him is older than any academic designation, preserved in the oral tradition of a community living in the shadow of something the world forgot to look at. That kind of knowledge. The name carried in a language that was never interrupted. The story kept alive in communities whose ancestors built what the archaeologists are excavating, is one of the things that modern Nubian scholarship is learning to treat as evidence rather than background. It took a long time to get there. This journey through ancient Nubia has covered roughly 5,000 years of human experience along one of the most significant rivers in the world. From the graves at Qustul and the questions they raised about who was first and what that question even means, through the urban complexity of Kerma and the Defufa, standing alone in the desert, and the cattle skulls in the tumuli, that told us this was a civilization with its own ideas about power and death and the proper relationship between kings and the cosmos. Through the long centuries of Egyptian occupation and the creative synthesis that occupation produced, the ram-headed Amun and the lion-headed Apidamak and the Queen Mother standing at the scale of a king on temple walls that were built in a tradition that predated Egyptian contact and outlasted Egyptian political control. Through Piye at the foot of the sacred mountain, kneeling before the god, before he claimed any authority at all, writing his own anger into his own victory monument, because correctness mattered to him more than the appearance of perfect triumph. Through the victory stele and everything it tells us about a man who understood his power as a genuine obligation rather than a license. Through Taharqa, who appears in the Hebrew Bible and in bronze in European museums, and whose pyramid still rises from the desert at Nuri, who built temples across Egypt and Nubia and came back from military defeat because the civilization that produced him was not finished, who died in exile, carrying the weight of what he had tried to hold. Through Meroe and its iron furnaces and its 6 clay vessels painted with borrowed signs saying something entirely their own. Through Amanishakato and the gold that was made for her and stayed with her for 2,000 years until the wrong person came with a pickaxe and a theory about where sophistication was and was not possible. Through the explanation of why this entire story was missing from the account of human civilization for so long, through the work being done right now, in the field and in the laboratory, to restore to the historical record what was always there and always deserved to be known. What do you take from all of that? Not the roads, though the roads were worn into the desert by generations of traders and soldiers and ordinary people going about their lives. Not the gold, though the gold came from this earth and shaped the economies of the ancient world. Not the pyramids, though the pyramids are still standing in the morning light, steeper than Egypt's, more numerous than Egypt's, rising from a desert the world forgot to look at. The real inheritance of ancient Nubia is something harder to quantify and more durable than any of those things. It is the demonstration that identity can be maintained through the most extreme pressure without becoming rigid, that a people can absorb the culture of a conqueror and use it to build something the conqueror never imagined, that the capacity for creative transformation, for taking what is given and making it entirely your own, is one of the most powerful things a civilization can develop. Ancient Nubia did this for 2,000 years. It absorbed Egyptian religious forms and produced a ram-headed Amun, who was more authentically Nubian than anything Egypt had given him. It absorbed Egyptian royal ideology and produced kings who went home to the sacred mountain when they died, because that was where they actually belonged. It absorbed the pyramid form and built 255 of them in a desert that the standard history of the world barely glanced at. Over 1,000 years, when Egypt had long since stopped building any, it absorbed pressure and transformed. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most extraordinary things a civilization can do. The Nile does not know that it is famous. It does not know that it appears in more history books than any other river on earth, that its floods shape the consciousness of civilizations, that the word Nile carries for billions of people an immediate association with antiquity and mystery, and a particular quality of golden light falling on ancient stone. It simply runs. It has been running for longer than the species that named it has existed. It ran before the first farmers settled its banks, and before the first kings built their tombs above its flood plain, and before the first priests offered the first incense to the first gods in the temples rising above its water. It will run after the last scholar has filed the last report on the last excavation, and after whatever comes, after all of that has come and gone in its turn. The past is not in the water. The past is in the ground, and in the stone, and in the objects that people made, and buried, and left behind. In the armlets made for a queen named Amenishiketo that stayed with her for 2,000 years until they were taken to cities she never knew existed. In the words Pa wrote in stone at Jebel Barkal about what it means to act correctly when you have the power to act any way you choose. In the bronze face of Taharqa looking out from a museum in Europe with the steady attention of a man who understood what was at stake and did not flinch from it. In the names carried in languages that were never interrupted. In the story that is still being assembled from all of those things by people who have decided that it matters. Tonight you know more about this river and this civilization than you did when this began. You know that the oldest story does not begin where you were told it begins. You know that 255 pyramids rose from a desert the world forgot to look at. You know that Amenishiketo was buried with jewelry that 2,000 years later would end up in Munich and Berlin, and that the people who put it there initially doubted it was real because of where it came from. You know that a man named Pa wrote his own anger into his victory monument because correctness mattered more to him than perfect triumph. You know that Taharqa is in the Bible. You know that the ram-headed Amun standing in his Nubian temple is not a copy of anything. He is his own thing, grown from specific soil, shaped by specific hands, expressing something that Egypt never expressed and never could. You know that a civilization can be present and invisible at the same time. And you know that what makes it visible again is not new evidence alone. It is the willingness to look at what was always there and let it mean what it actually means. That willingness is what this night has been about. The room is quiet now. The darkness outside is the same darkness that has fallen over the Nile Valley every night, for as long as there has been a Nile Valley. Somewhere in the desert of northern Sudan, the pyramids at Meroe are in that darkness, their silhouettes rising from the sand, their surfaces holding the memory of the light that moved across them today and the light that will move across them tomorrow, still there, as they have been there for 2,000 years. As they will be there long after this voice goes quiet and the night deepens and the river runs on and the stars that the Meroitic priests once watched move slowly across the sky above the desert, unchanged and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful. The oldest story does not end where the textbooks stop telling it. It continues in the ground and in the stone, and in the names that were never forgotten. In the child near the river, who knows the oldest name for the pyramid in her village. And now, in some small way, in you, the river runs on,